You're listening to Big World Network.
Average, Season 1, Episode 10. Written by Jonathan Thompson, read by Heather Thompson. The LaGuardias were a truly fascinating family. As fantastic as Vinny and Gail were, it was like they were only given a limited supply of greatness to distribute to their kids. But it didn't happen evenly. All the good stuff that made Vinny and Gail who they were trickled down through their children in a gradually narrowing stream. In most families, each child probably has different traits in common with their parents. Sometimes it's a strength, sometimes it's a weakness. But each LaGuardia child was an anomaly, with things getting steadily more difficult and just plain weird as you went down the line. James, the oldest, was a tall, lean, angular 25-year-old with a prominent nose. Prominent is actually putting it politely. Massive, or protruding, would be much more accurate, but not as polite. He was a firefighter in the same sense that Cosmo was Italian and Vinny was a cop and I was a nerd. It defined his identity and was used as an explanation or excuse for just about everything he did. And James was an obvious extension of his father, building on the precious local fame that Vinny had accumulated for the glorious LaGuardia name through his daring exploits as a police officer. James had moved out a few years ago into a house that Cosmo helped him buy right down the street, but he was still back at the family home constantly, and every time he walked through the door, he was treated like a rock star by Cosmo, who took credit for every good thing about James. Granted, Cosmo did that for all the kids, but it was pretty obvious to everyone that James was his crowning glory. Even at this Sunday dinner, Cosmo lowered himself into the chair at the head of the table to open the meal and simultaneously sung the praises of both himself and James in one breath. "Would you look at this boy?" Cosmo said to the room. "Like a Roman statue. Look at that proud nose. He gets it from my side." Cosmo was really, truly gifted at these complimentary brags. Or complibrags? Braglaments? Whatever they're called, Cosmo might actually hold a trademark on them. It's definitely a unique skill, though. Try it sometime. It takes some real skill to pull off. I always felt bad for Mike, the middle child. I personally really liked Mike, but he didn't have much going for him. Not by LaGuardia standards, at least. Mike slouched at the table as far from Cosmo as he could, wearing a baggy Real Big Fish t-shirt. At 19, Mike was the oddball in his family for several reasons. For one, his parents and older brother took issue with his lack of ambition, or at least what they saw as acceptable ambitions. Personally, I thought his goal of being a master sommelier was pretty awesome. Not that I knew anything about wine at my age, but it seemed like a pretty cool profession to undertake. Cosmo, meanwhile, had no patience for Mike's flat-out refusal to eat just about anything Cosmo cooked. To me, it was sort of heroic. Tonight, as usual, Mike had come into the room late and slumped into his chair. "Hey, George," he said casually. "Sup, Quinn?" Mike looked with silent disapproval over the sauce-covered spread. Skipping over the main dishes, Mike reached for the bread. But Cosmo simply could not stand for this. He didn't make the bread. "Mike, I made your favorite, pickled artichokes. You love those!" And of course, last but not least among the LaGuardia children was Grace. Nobody except Gail had talked to Grace so far tonight, and even then it was in hushed, careful tones. I had ventured a smile when we first sat at the table, but wasn't brave enough to actually say anything. My dad was, though. "Grace, what's the matter? You're always so gloomy," Dad said. Someone audibly gasped. It was probably me. But she didn't take a swing at him across the table or let loose an onslaught of insults or anything. She just looked at him coolly and took one slow blink. "I'm just not feeling well." "She'll be okay," Gail smiled. "All right," Cosmo interrupted. "Are you ready to eat? Come on, how many people get to eat like this?" Overcooked chicken smothered in jarred sauce, I thought. Tons, probably. And for a second time that night, I was genuinely frightened by Cosmo. Usually it was just more of a frustration. Cosmo always had this amazing sort of intuition about people, like he was fully conscious of everything that was going on around him. I always chalked this up to paranoia that drove him to try to control every situation. But now it was starting to freak me out. He turned his head to look directly at me. The curly auburn hair that wrapped around the back and sides of his head quivered wildly. The chickens cooked perfectly, and I made the sauce myself, Cosmo said calmly. Oblivious, my dad shouted, "Fantastic! Vinny, can I get that chicken?" And thus began the most awkward and fear-inspiring dinner of my life.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.